Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the second part of my Final Fantasy series retrospective. If you didn't see the first part, I covered Final Fantasy 1, 2, and 3. I am a huge Final Fantasy fan, big collector of pretty much everything Final Fantasy. Even when it gets bad, I still have to support it. But yeah, it's not bad this time because we are covering Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6, some of the best RPGs ever made, and definitely worth talking about. Before we get started, I want to call out something that came out since the last time I did the retrospective. This is the Final Fantasy Ultimania Archive. So it's a kind of compilation of some books that came out in Japan. I've always dug them. I owned a couple of them, but they were kind of useless with me not being able to read them. But this is just a really nice book that covers Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And just a great release by Dark Horse. So for Final Fantasy collectors, definitely something worth checking out. So let's start off with Final Fantasy IV, or as it was known over here, Final Fantasy II. The first Final Fantasy game for the SNES was released in North America as Final Fantasy II, but is really the fourth game in the series. Re-releases on later consoles after FF7 came out have updated it with the correct numbering, which helps with some of the confusion. The added power of the Super Nintendo allowed Squaresoft to finally focus on the character and storytelling aspects they've always wanted for the series. So the game introduces a cast of memorable characters and a really interesting, though sometimes crazy storyline. Apparently during development, the original script was way too much for a card at the time and had to be significantly reduced. The game stars the Dark Knight Cecil, commander of Baron Kingdom's Red Wings Air Force. After questioning the king about his ruthless tactics in stealing crystals from other kingdoms, he's stripped of his rank and sent on a mission for forgiveness that ends up putting him on a path of redemption and has him go up against his own kingdom and the forces that rule it and threaten the world. There are some big story reveals and a ton of great characters, including his friend Kane, girlfriend Rosa, the summoner Rydia, and the mysterious Golbez. Each character has their own class with strengths and weaknesses and their own set of specific skills. The battle system ups the party limit to 5 characters at once, which is the most in any single-player mainline Final Fantasy game. It's also the first game to use the active time battle system, where instead of choosing all your actions at once, your character's commands and actions all function based on timers. This adds some tension to the battle, since enemies can keep attacking you while you pick commands. An interesting idea in some of the boss battles here, though, is that they're designed like puzzles. You can't just mash your way through and have to pick the right tactics to win. So like the first video, let's go through the stuff I have in my collection, starting with the original cartridge for Final Fantasy IV for the Famicom. This is the original Japanese release of Final Fantasy IV. There's not a whole lot to say about it, so let's just compare the later releases to it. That starts with Final Fantasy II, as I pointed out before. For the SNES version that we got in English, because Final Fantasy II and 3 weren't released here, Square thought players wouldn't be able to understand how to play the game well, so they lowered the difficulty quite a bit. Even the instruction manual kind of includes a walkthrough for the first half of the game. Notably, the translation is bad on top of the Japanese version cuts, which leads to a pretty confusing plot. Because of that release, Japan got Final Fantasy IV Easy Type. This is an easier version of Final Fantasy IV released for the Super Famicom that was based on the English release but featured more different changes. And then we got a PlayStation version of Final Fantasy IV in Final Fantasy Chronicles, which came bundled with Chrono Trigger. The PS1 version is based on the original Japanese Final Fantasy IV and not the easy version. It adds a run button that lets you move faster, opening and ending cutscenes, and a completely new English translation. And a Japan-only release, the Wonder Swan Color version of Final Fantasy IV. Like the other Wonder Swan releases, this just includes updated graphics with new sprites. And over here we got Final Fantasy IV Advance for the GBA. This is based on the WonderSwan Color version, but the graphics have been updated even more. It uses an updated version of the PlayStation 1 script, and bars are added in for the active time battle system like the later games have. It also has 2 new extra dungeons, and a late game option that lets you change out the members of your party. The party was always fixed in the original game, but now you can swap out members and try out the game's challenges with different characters, which make for some pretty fun and interesting gameplay changes from the original. And after that, Final Fantasy IV for the DS, which is a complete remake in 3D. The game now looks similar to the Final Fantasy III DS version, and just about everything is changed in it, so that previous knowledge of Final Fantasy IV really didn't help you get through the game. The script was changed completely too, bringing back elements that were cut from the original script, and there's a new Game Plus mode, 2 extra bosses, and various new gameplay systems. It's a really tough game. Squaresoft went out of their way to make this even harder than the original release. It's kind of a pain, but it is a cool version of the game if you can get through it. An update of this version was also released on iOS, Android, and Steam later. And after that was the PSP release of Final Fantasy IV: The Complete Collection. This isn't the 3D game, it's an update of the original 2D version with graphics similar to Final Fantasy 1 and 2 Anniversary on the PSP. This one has another updated script, this time based on the GBA version instead of the DS one. One neat addition is that you can switch between the DS and SNES music. All the Final Fantasy IV advanced post-game content and party member swapping is also in here, and the game is bundled with its sequel Final Fantasy IV: The After Years, and the exclusive Final Fantasy IV Interlude, a short game that takes place between the two and you can only play here. Final Fantasy IV: The After Years was an episodic sequel to Final Fantasy IV that was made way after the original game for Japanese cell phones. We first got it in English on the Nintendo Wii through its WiiWare service. You could get the prologue where you played as Cecil and Rosa's son Theodore, and then get extra chapters for a couple bucks each. Every chapter revolved around a different character from the original game, and the last chapter brought everyone together. The PSP release of The After Years featured updated graphics to match the original game there, and a 3D version of it was released just like the DS version that was available on iOS, Android, and Steam. So yeah, to go through the other kind of ancillary stuff I've got for Final Fantasy IV, I have the original Japanese soundtrack. This is a more recent release I picked up at Distant Worlds. And I have the Final Fantasy Chronicles strategy guide for the PS1 version, and the Final Fantasy Advance strategy guide. The one thing that I know I'm missing is the Final Fantasy IV DS strategy guide. It's a little pricey, but it's something I'm keeping my eyes open for. So that's about it for Final Fantasy IV. Which brings us to Final Fantasy V, which was originally released for the Super Famicom, but the Super Nintendo version was never released. This is the only Final Fantasy Super Nintendo game we never got over here at the time. At first, the game was considered too complex for an English release, and the translation process was slow going. It was originally going to be released as Final Fantasy III, but they held off and instead planned to release it as Final Fantasy Extreme after Final Fantasy VI came out. But in the end, that was never released either. We didn't get it until we got Final Fantasy Anthology for the PS1. Final Fantasy V is an interesting combination of how the series approached characters in the previous 2 games. Like Final Fantasy IV, the game introduces a cast of defined characters with their own looks, personalities, and backstories. But like Final Fantasy III, those characters could be developed in any way through the job system, which allowed the player to assign and level up classes for them. The class system from Final Fantasy III was expanded and is really the standout part of this game. There are 22 jobs in the original game and 26 in the GBA version. Each job has its own job level and goes up as the character earns job points through battle. You can also equip some abilities from the classes you've already leveled when using a different job. The battle system is similar to Final Fantasy IV, except that now gauges are added so you can see when characters' turns are going to come up or when spells are about to be cast. The game stars Bartz, a traveler who meets a princess, pirate, and strange old man only to get swept up in their stories surrounding a mysterious meteor crash and the world's crystals shattering. There's several shocking moments and story twists as the party explores 3 different overworlds. So yeah, I have the original Super Famicom version, and I have a repro cart that someone made for me that's got the English translation on there. And next up was the Final Fantasy Anthology Edition I talked about, which bundles Final Fantasy V and 6 on here. I think it's worth pointing out, I didn't mention before, that these games don't run that great, the PS1 versions. There's load times in between the battles, which is really frustrating, but they're still pretty interesting. This PS1 version included the English translation and new opening and ending CG cutscenes. There was no WonderSwan version, so next up was Final Fantasy V Advance. This version features minor graphical updates, a new English translation, 4 new job classes, and an extra dungeon and boss. There were also iOS, Android, and PC versions released, which feature new redrawn 2D sprites that are really fugly compared to the originals. So to go through some of my extra stuff, I have the soundtrack, same as the 4 one. I have the Final Fantasy Anthology Strategy Guide for PS1 that covers both Final Fantasy V and 6. And then I have the real interesting piece for this series, the VHS tapes, the 2-tape collection of Final Fantasy Legend of the Crystals. This was an anime that did come over here dubbed in VHS only. It is 4 30-minute episodes, and it takes place 200 years after the original game. Japan also got a manga version of this, which was mostly just screen grabs of the anime in color. The game stars new characters Pret and a descendant of Bart's, or Butts Lenali, who tries to recover the 3 stolen crystals. They have to go up against the evil wizard Radevil. It's an okay anime adaptation, especially for the time. It gets a lot of hate, but I've always thought it was decent. The one thing I know I'm missing here is the Final Fantasy V Advanced Strategy Guide, which I think is even rarer than the 4 one I'm missing, so yeah, something else I'm keeping my eye out for. And that brings us to the next game, Final Fantasy VI, or as it was released over here, Final Fantasy III. This is probably my favorite RPG, maybe my favorite game of all time if I really had to think about it. Final Fantasy VI is an epic about a group of rebels trying to take down an evil empire that are enslaving magical beings to use their power for warfare. There are a ton of characters with interesting pasts, including one of the best villains in all of video games. There's an incredible mid-game switch that really mixes things up too. The game starts off with Terra, a girl with magical abilities who's being controlled by the Empire. She comes across a magical being and gets freed from her mind control, only to meet up with the treasure hunter Locke, King Edgar and his brother Sabin, and other members of the rebel group, the Returners. They all fight back against the Emperor, his advisor Kefka, and his generals Celis and Leo. Along the way, Terra, or Tina in Japanese, learns about her own past, the history of espers in the world, and about the powers that keep the world in balance. The world map is now Mode 7 enhanced, and the sprite work and other environments really help the game feel a lot less flat than traditional RPG designs of this era. The game structure consists of 2 distinct halves. The first half is fairly traditional, with the player completing objectives in order, and the second is a more open world that can be explored in order to complete optional side quests to get new items, magic, and to add new playable characters to the party. The game has 14 playable characters that can be swapped in and out of your 4-player party, and at some parts of the game, including the notable last dungeon, the player can create 3 different parties who explore separately, so 12 characters can be used at once in these areas. The job system is gone, and the classes are more vague in this than they are in past entries. Instead, each character has a unique special command. These can be really varied, including the use of sub-weapons, learning enemy attacks, special attacks on the timer, or entering specific inputs. Along with that, the player will find espers through Magicite that every character can equip. While an esper is equipped, the player can summon them and learn the spells associated with that esper by earning AP in battle. Yeah, and then to bring back Final Fantasy Anthology, this is where we got the PS1 version of it. In this one, it's officially called Final Fantasy VI again, and is pretty true to the original with just the CGI cutscenes added. Then, like the other two, we got a version for Game Boy Advance with Final Fantasy VI Advance. This Game Boy version features a number of changes, including a more accurate translation, 4 new espers, and 2 optional bonus dungeons. Like Final Fantasy V, there was also a release for iOS, Android, and PC that featured the same ugly art style with Final Fantasy V. And yeah, to go through the extra stuff I got, not much. I've got the Final Fantasy VI Japanese soundtrack, and yeah, I got 2 of the SNES strategy guides. The Nintendo Player's Guide for Final Fantasy III SNES, and the, who put this out? Infotainment World Books Final Fantasy III Player's Guide. And of course, I'm not going to pull it back out, but I've got the Final Fantasy Anthology Strategy Guide. Is the Kefka's Domain soundtrack, which, you know, pretty surprising for its time, is a 3-disc soundtrack for Final Fantasy VI that was released over here. So probably the exact same as this one, just a release that came out here that I don't have. So I got to keep my eyes out for that. So yeah, one last thing is the second Sky book, The Art of Final Fantasy 4, 5, and 6. I showed off the first Sky book with my last video, but I didn't have the whole box here at the time. So yeah, this is the amazing The Sky, The Art of Final Fantasy box set by Amano. So yeah, this is The Sky, The Art of Final Fantasy, which includes a whole bunch of artwork by Amano. This box is incredible. It comes with 5 books. The first book covering 1, 2, and 3. The second book that's right here covering 4, 5, and 6. Another book covering 7, 8, 9, and 10. And then another little book that's just about Amano and a small premium flip book. So a really cool set for Final Fantasy fans. Before I just wrap this up, I just want to say I know there's one more Final Fantasy Super Nintendo game I didn't talk about, but it's not related to 4, 5, and 6, so I'm holding off on that until I do a kind of side story episode later on. Thanks for checking out this video. I'm going to get a video up with the 3 PlayStation games next, 7, 8, and 9, so stay tuned for that. Subscribe and share, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.